Hello PANcasters and welcome back. Today Olivier is back to talk to us about monitoring. Welcome back, Olivier.
Thanks, John. Good to be back on PANCast.
So Olivier, today is about monitoring. What are we going to be talking about specifically?
Well, monitoring in general is pretty important to make sure any environment is operating correctly, and for Palo Alto Networks product, it is no different. There are a lot of different options when it comes to monitoring our product, so we don't have time to cover all in detail in one episode. This is more an overview of the options we have.
Great, Olivier. So where do we start?
Okay, before we get into the different options, let's discuss some high-level topics. Firstly, monitoring can be either on the device itself, such as checking local logs or running CLI commands, or it can be external. For instance, you have a syslog server that is receiving logs, and you can use this server to do log analysis. The second thing is we can broadly categorize monitoring into fault monitoring and performance monitoring. Fault monitoring is, as it suggests, that there is an issue with the device and an event or log is generated to inform the required teams that there is an issue and it needs to be investigated. Performance monitoring is more related to the health of a device and will cover things like throughput, CPU utilization, and memory utilization. With performance monitoring, the idea is to take measure at regular intervals and have this monitored constantly. It's also possible to have some alert in place by setting some threshold. So for instance, if the data plane CPU goes above 80%, you can generate an alert.
Okay, so what options do we then have with Palo Alto Networks devices?
Okay, let's start with fault monitoring. Panorama and Palo Alto Networks Firewall have logging enabled and will log various system events. This is okay if you log into a device and have a look at the logs, but really you want to be notified of critical events so you can take action. The most common way is to use SNMP traps. With SNMP traps, you can send events to a SNMP receiver, which could then also be used to automatically generate an incident for the operation teams to look at. This can be based on the severity of the alert, so maybe for critical and high event, an incident is automatically raised, but for low and informational, the events are still received, but can be reviewed non-real time. With Palo Alto Networks logging, we actually have a number of methods we can forward events to external systems. On top of SNMP, which is the most common one, we also support HTTP, email, and syslog. Syslog is also very commonly used, but more in situations where you want to send things like traffic logs for long-term storage. While we can look for events on the firewall or Panorama, SNMP is still the most widely used setup for alerting on events.
Thanks, Olivier. What about performance monitoring?
Well, SNMP is also probably the most widely used here, where SNMP traps covers event. SNMP pooling allow you to have real-time monitoring on devices. This can be set up so you pull data on the device over time, and then you'll get historical data of, let's say, data plane CPU, throughput, packet per second, and so on and so on. The data you collect is based on MIBs, so some are generic MIBs, and you have also vendor-specific MIBs. We have our Palo Alto Network MIBs, which allow you to pull for specific data on Palo Alto Networks devices. A lot of detailed data on our firewall is in what are called global counters. And while you can do this via CLI, if working on an active issue, you can also graph most of them via SNMP. Now, while the preference would be to use a dedicated SNMP server for polling, it may not be possible in all cases, so for customers using Panorama to manage their firewalls, we do have a device monitoring section on Panorama. This will graph the common data point like CPU and throughput over time, so you can monitor your firewalls. It also baselines the data and can alert if current trends don't match the baseline.
Thanks, Olivier. So it sounds like SNMP is the most common monitoring system used. Anything we should be aware of with SNMP?
Good question. On the topic of SNMP MIBs, you need to make sure the MIBs you are using are loaded on the SNMP pooling server, so all the value pooled have a correct definition. Also keep in mind that SNMP pooling is interval based, so depending on the configuration on your SNMP server, it may not show the accurate information. The last point I want to discuss is the version of SNMP. The two current ones are version 2 and version 3. Version 2 is still widely used. However, I advise you to consider to move to SNMP v3. It doesn't require much configuration, and the main benefit is it improves the security with authentication and encryption for SNMP.
Got it. I know we also have the ACC on the firewalls. Does this fall into monitoring as well?
Yes, the ACC is another tool which is on our firewalls and on Panorama, and it is mostly used for data on traffic, session, threat. It is built on the traffic and threat logs and can be great for a high-level view. It does also have stats like bytes, but there's a couple of things to be aware on with the ACC. Firstly, the ACC data is all based on the logs, so the important thing here is that if you have policies that do not have logging enabled, that traffic will not be in the ACC. The second gotcha is the byte statistics. Again, because the data is based on the logs and logs on Palo Alto Networks device are generated at the session end, it can be sometimes misleading. As an example, let's say you have a data transfer between two servers that keep the session open indefinitely and transfer a lot of data. For some reason, the session terminates and only then the log is generated. That log has a generate time, which is what the ACC use. But the data transferred shows much bigger value. In reality, the byte transferred will be split over the time of the session, but that info is not currently tracked. The ACC has great info, but just a couple of things to be aware of.
Great. Any other monitoring protocols we support?
Yes, there are a few more. I won't go into too much detail, but just so listeners are aware, these are available with Palo Alto Networks. Firstly is OpenConfig. OpenConfig is a set of vendor neutral model that allow monitoring via GNMI. This allows telemetry streaming to monitor device. NetFlow may also be something you have heard before and is also supported on Palo Alto Networks devices. NetFlow is more for traffic passing through the firewall and can send session and stream information to a NetFlow collector for additional analysis. And finally, there is the XML API. Also, this is more commonly used to configure devices. There are some limited use cases where you can use the API for monitoring information.
You also mentioned checking logs locally and CLI commands. When would we use this?
They would be helpful when you are looking at an issue. Hopefully, one of the other monitoring systems will have picked up the issue and you are then troubleshooting why. You will then perhaps look at the local logs, including debug logs, and also CLI command to troubleshoot. We did an earlier episode that focused a bit on the logging part, so a listener can check out that episode.
Thanks, Olivier. Finally, can I ask, what do we do if monitoring is not working?
Well, that really depends on which part. If we are talking about the event or the logs on the device, then the first thing would be to check the configuration. If that all looks okay and you suspect an issue with the device, then it may need deeper analysis and probably best to raise the tag case. For external services like SNMP and syslog, again, the configuration is the first place to start. If that all looks okay, remember this will require network connectivity. So you can start with some basic network connectivity check. Can you ping the SNMP server from the firewall? Any logs showing connection errors? Maybe a packet capture on the firewall to see if traps are sent or pooling requests are coming in.
Great info. Thanks again, Olivier.
You're welcome, John. Hope to be back soon.
Would love to have you back. Pancasters, as always, the transcript to the episode will be on live.paloaltonetworks.com, and remember to subscribe and like.